that some sort of action happens now. People actually go and look up what's going on with the movement. And I think we hear this from CG as well. And I think that's a deadlock right now. I think it's largely irresolvable. CEO's position here is that even without action, we're going to tell you why today. The performance in itself is actively good for creating change. And as a result, I think you get buy-in from the most important actors. And this is what I think is important, which is that I think a lot of the debate so far has been translating how you get support for your movement. But let's be real, support for your movement does not translate into action until the corporations you are targeting or the politicians you are lobbying actually change, and why we're going to tell you why we get those two stakeholders only in CEO. I'm going to do a couple pieces of extraneous rebuttal to CG first before I get into just a couple of extensions. First, though, I think we get this argument from CG that's just like, one, you're inundated with so much different things now because you're focused on like nitty gritty movements of like Microsoft's logo, and at the same time they say that like social movements benchmark themselves to performance, and as a result, no one is just like motivated, things like that. Firstly, I think this argument implicitly concedes that accountability is so much more clear, right? Because now you have three groups of people or corporations. You've groups that actively say something and actually do something, groups that are performative, and groups do nothing at all. So at the very worst case for us, you still get accountability to just corporations that actually do not even talk about it. I think that is something that is revealed and comparatively better than the other world. But the second thing is I don't think it's actually true that we just wash our hands for corporations after they tweet a support and or like sell a rainbow flag. I think it's likely the case that we still hold them accountable. And I think if anything, the media that trends around corporations is going to cause them to be accountable. And that's what we're going to get to in terms of the extension. Then finally, about this argument that just like people don't feel motivated, I don't actually think that's true. And I don't think CG gets a claim to get people Googling things on their side of the house. I think the core base of your movement is symmetric to either side of the house here. They will act and they will perform. We think that is what we are talking about specifically. And I think OO honestly has done a pretty good job with that. Won't dap them up even more here. Two extensions here. First is why we get buy-ins from institutions and corporations that are the ones perpetrating the actions that we want to reform. Note the frame, there are a million activist movements, of which not all of them come through politics. So not all of them will get resolved at the voting booth, or at the voting booth, dozens of them get resolved at once, which means the impact of each individual social movement on politics is actually relatively minimal. The more important thing is getting the institutions that need to be regulated or actually are acting and are bad actors on your side and willing to reform. Note that it is particularly difficult to get institutions to change their heart with a small group, given that they don't act until their bottom line is actually hurt. We think on our side of the house, you force the hand for corporations to comply with two mechanisms. The first now is that corporations now are in the spotlight, which just forces them to act because they fear the risk of losing their main consumer base. We think corporations are likely to want to buy in by doing the reform themselves. It's more amenable to them now because when they're in the bad spotlight, they're able to issue a public statement saying things that they're actually doing. It makes them look good, and it means that we get actual reform on our side of the house. But two, the solutions are now allowed to be internal, right? Corporations are getting canceled, but they're allowed to create ways to uncancel themselves, as opposed to hyper-specific actions that I think activist movements also often force on corporations when they go through politics that corporations just find unrealistic. What does all this look like? I think this looks like, for example, oil majors like Shell shifting into investments for ESG, or consumer retail companies improving labor rights for their workers. Note also the second mechanism here is that politicians are likely to speak out against a corporation, even if the politician doesn't act, right? It's so easy for me as a politician to just tweet a mean tweet about a corporation, but we think then that this actually creates a risk for the corporation, which is the corporation now has to assess the potential for future regulation, which means they're actually incentivized to reform to dodge the future regulation. Note, though, that these are not the same mechanisms as what we hear from OO, even though they are both about media. That's because OO is focus on how media might get actual policy, which we again think is not necessarily, the strongest link. But secondly, more importantly, we think that corporations are specifically risk averse to losing even a small percentage of their customer base. You don't need 100% or even 50% of a critical mass anymore. You only need 10, 20% of a company's customers to get pissed off, join the social movement, or at the very minimum, perform and not buy their products or buy a competitor. And all of that is sufficiently damaging to the bottom line to corporations reform. These arguments are just so much more important, right? Because the core base of social movements is going to exist on either side of the house. It's going to act, but they do not trigger the point to which corporations reform until they think there's a material impact on their bottom line. I think you only get that from CEO. I'll take opening.
Yeah, we are the ones that prove why performative expressivism is actively bad for getting support of corporations, because it creates radicalization and polarizing opinions on the subject, which leads to more risk of losing customers if they actively support this subject, and less consensus support for it, which would lead to corporations getting involved.
Sure, yeah. This is not about corporations acting in social movements. It is about corporations who are being canceled by social movements, the ones in the bad spotlight. We think they reform when you focus on performance, when you focus on everyone retweeting how bad it is. The Gap, for instance, is exploiting child labor abroad. Second mechanism and second argument from CEO today is why we get buy-in from politicians. I think there's this huge irresolvable like mobilization debate. Like, what do you get and how do you get the critical mass of mobilization? We don't think you need that mobilization actually on our side of the house, or to the very extent, we don't think you need such a large mobilization that I think OO gives you. What we do think is that accountability of politicians, it enhances significantly, which is politicians themselves speak out performatively at first in support of certain movements. If they don't, they get canceled. This looks like politicians tweeting, even moderates, tweeting support for things like Black Lives Matter, etc. Why is that important? It makes accountability so much better. Note that the comparative is that the politician just doesn't speak out about an issue at all if it isn't trending in the media, and they won't get canceled for not speaking out. This creates pressure on the politician to, at least in the very next cycle, vote in favor of the legislation that they've historically said that they supported on Twitter, so they don't get canceled in the next election cycle. Why is this a worse form for them than if they just were silent? Note that it is way easier to win an election on the idea that your opponent was a liar, said they supported certain things, and then went back on it. Note also that candidates don't lose on one policy issue, but they do lose on turning against their own tweets, turning against their own beliefs. And we think that is the point at which the politicians actually care enough to support the bills that are being proposed. We think on either side, some politicians will propose policies to pass that do good. It is about getting these politicians and then sign onto those bills, which we think only happens to the point where there's a meaningful threat to the